Thank you so much. My name is Nasser El-Batal. I'll be introducing TOGAF to you. TOGAF stands for the Open Group Architecture Framework. It's the latest and greatest enterprise architecture best practice in the industry. One of the frameworks that the industry is actually using more and more on ongoing basis. Next slide. So enterprise architecture is pretty much needed as a response to many business-related issues, as you're aware. Some of the most important of these issues is to make sure that we have proper structure, is to make sure that we have proper traceability from strategic layer all the way down to operational layers, making sure that you have proper control and governance, making sure that you follow a structured approach to developing, implementing, governing, and controlling your architecture based on certain principles, certain policies, in alignment with business strategies and with other potential regulatory requirements. Next, please. So before we engage in setting up enterprise architecture frameworks or models, you want to make sure that you have your house in order. In other words, there are a certain set of best practices that you have to consider in order for your business transformation to be successful. Things, as an example, like business analysis, things like IT service management, or program and or project management. In addition, of course, to security management, as well as a sound best practice that you're going to follow for enterprise architecture. And there are a number of them in the industry today. I mean, TOGAF is one of them. However, you have something like Zachman or something like Gartner or whatever the case. So you want to make sure that your house is in order from the best practices that will support and enable your enterprise architecture model. So what we see on the screen, that almost yellow wheel, as we see, this is what is known as the architecture development method of TOGAF. If you take a kind of a closer look at this, and let me get the pen, I'll show you what I mean by that. If you split this wheel in half, right? The right side is basically the side where you are developing your architecture, strategizing, preparing, establishing requirement management, all the way to implementing. So the right side of the activity is to ensure that you have the proper architectures in place. The left side is where you're gonna govern and control, right, your enterprise architecture in relationship to what eventually you're gonna have in operation. And this is basically what looks like in terms of the steps, as well as some of the activities in the red box. So we do things that we're all familiar with day in and day out, something like baselining or gap analysis or road mapping or business analysis, financial management, and so on. The difference here is that we're doing them in specific areas within the architecture development method. The green boxes are additional frameworks that we kind of integrated into the model. So TOGAF is not very strong on governance. With that in mind, we steal and borrow from COBIT. So control objective for IT, if anybody had heard, with that. We use capability maturity model integrated to do maturity assessment and to have a better understanding as to what is the level of maturity that we have within the organization. From there on, as an example, you have to make a framework. What I mean by that, today in the industry, many different frameworks and best practices, and some organizations make a very big mistake in introducing multiple frameworks, but at the same time they are introducing multiple processes. So you need to kind of integrate the set of frameworks that you want to introduce, make your own, and filter the duplication and all of the above from a process perspective, so that you have the appropriate, pretty much set of best practices in place. So going back to TOGAF itself, where is TOGAF coming from? TOGAF comes from an organization called the Open Group. The Open Group is pretty much the owner and the governing body of the subject matter. It is a global organization, and with that in mind, they have satellite offices and forums throughout the world. They basically initiated TOGAF based on a number of different practices. As an example, something called TAFM, for Technical Architecture Framework for Information Management, or Department of Defense Architecture Framework, or international standards. So the collection of all of the above pretty much is what TOGAF is about, from the Open Group. TOGAF is structured based on 7 main components. The ones that are really kind of used are 6. The first one is just an introduction. So it talks a little bit about, what the Open Group is, where TOGAF comes from, but there is no technical information per se, right? So we have, although we call them 7 components, but the one in action are 6. So the wheel that I just showed you in the middle, of the diagram here is the ADM Architecture Development Method. This is supported by, guidelines and techniques, and of course we need, the body, or as we call it, the content framework. This is the companion of the ADM because it establishes, the minimum building blocks that the ADM supposed to generate. Part 5 is associated with tools, technologies, and continuums. Part 6 and 7 is basically a reference model, and eventually, after everything is said and done, Part 7 will show us as to the capability that we currently have after we implemented the framework. So the framework is going to become the bridge between your baseline, between your vision, mission, strategy, and the desired business capabilities that you want to accomplish, right? The framework is based on 4 domains: business architecture, application architecture, data or information architecture, and technical architecture. This is what I showed you a little bit earlier. I called it on the right side of the ADM. Those are basically the domains whereby you are developing the appropriate architectures to support the business, or to support application or data or technology. So again, on the left, top left corner, the architecture development method. it's an iterative approach. You have the ability to cycle and recycle depending on what you're doing. The content framework, as I said, this is the companion of the ADM, and it enables you pretty much to introduce the minimum or the basic building blocks required. So as an example, you will see correlation, right, between what the ADM is performing and what the architecture content framework is requesting, right? So this correlation is enabling you to introduce the appropriate building blocks or develop the appropriate building blocks based on the details in the content framework. And then you're going to follow some sort of a reference architecture, some sort of a reference model. And it depends, which part of the industry you belong to, which vertical in the industry, whether your industry is health or defense or financials or whatever the case may be. You will have many different type of reference architectures that you can follow. There are additional guidelines and techniques. Those are the ones that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The business analysis, stakeholder management, iterations, and so on, all under the hat of guidelines and techniques. Enterprise continuum is the logical view as to what your architecture repository is going to look like, right? What are the classifications of the different building blocks and the different reference models that you're going to have, right, in the organization? It's all in the enterprise continuum. And as I said, eventually, after everything is said and done, now you can claim that you have the proper people, processes, technology, governance, programs, and that you have reached a certain level of maturity. So thereby you have your architecture capability that you have achieved, for your organization. A critical success factor of a good enterprise architecture framework is proper governance. Governance, for those of you who are familiar, basically is a structure from corporate to IT to architecture and so on. This is, how you're going to operate, how you're going to control, how you're going to manage, right, the organization, the deliverables, the agreements, the roles and responsibilities, right? And there are activities associated with governance in multiple areas, activities associated with architecture, activities associated with program management, activities associated with service management, all of which are very much dependent on what you're going to have in the continuum or in the repository in terms of agreements and processes and regulatory requirements that you have to align, with, and so on. So to make a long story short, you will need a solid governance structure to be able to achieve meaningful architecture set of activities. What I'm trying to do in this diagram is to show you that there is a lot of business analysis activities associated with the enterprise architecture model. All the bubbles where they have some sort of a shade, in red or burgundy, whichever color you're seeing on your screen, these are areas where business analysis, is involved as an activity. And, you have to very much correlate, TOGAF with something like BABOK, the business analysis body of knowledge. The paper clips that you see, this is an example of the recycling or loopbacks or iteration, whatever you want to call it. So you have four main areas, right? As I mentioned in the model, business architecture. Under information system, you have two, domains, data and application. and under technology, technology. So you have 4 domains in that side. You also have 4 cycles in the ADM. One cycle is what we call the development cycle. Another one is the transition planning cycle. Another one is a governance cycle. And one that is not documented on the screen is between preliminary and vision, which is what we call capability cycle. So before you engage in any sort of architecture, you have to assess your architecture capabilities and whether you have the ability to absorb, right, the project, right? So something to keep in mind. This is a list of artifacts that potentially you may need to generate as a result of your architecture exercise. So these are basically the diagrams, the matrices, the catalogs that will constitute your architecture. The combination of these artifacts will constitute your architecture. This is also what we call viewpoints. So as a stakeholder, you may be interested in strategy or in business or in application and so on. So the scope of deliverables that I'm gonna introduce to you is that vertical. So if you belong to the business, then your deliverable is gonna be part of business architecture. If you belong to technology, then the deliverable is gonna be, you know, associated with technology and so on and so forth. So we select out of this combination which catalogs, matrices, and diagrams that will fulfill the requirements that you are looking for, right? This is going to be, going back here for a sec, this is going to be an output that you're going to generate from the right side of the ADM, all right? That's going to look, you know, something like these titles, and what you're going to generate from here is going to reside in your repository. So you are basically transforming your strategic corporate plans and strategies onto enterprise architecture activities and deliverables. So we have a number, right, of phases, as you already have seen. Phase A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, right? And each and every one of them is aligned with a certain level of your business structure. So phase A is aligned with strategy. Phase B, C, and D are aligned with the capability or the outcomes that you want to generate. Phase E and F are aligned with the capability increments as well that you're gonna generate. So what's your project gonna look like? What kind of deliverables at the end of the day you're gonna introduce? And finally, you know, your building blocks that will translate to your solutions. All of this, you know, is the basis associated with different projects portfolios, different project increments, and will deliver what we call your capability increment solutions. So this, in a nutshell, to enable you or to show you that we are aligning, right, or transforming your strategy all the way down to, right, operational deliverables, which is a very powerful statement, right, and a very powerful set of activities that you are performing as a result of your architecture. Throughout the activities, you want to make sure, of course, that whatever you are introducing has the proper quality, efficiency, effectiveness as needed and required by the business. The framework is going to enable you a common language, is going to enable you a reusable, repeatable pattern of building blocks and artifacts, It's going to enable you an end-to-end, holistic, comprehensive, suite that basically will bridge, your business models to policies to implementations, right? So it's a very powerful framework to follow. This is just very quickly to say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So your implementation, is going to be reflected in artifacts that translate basically what the message is all about. So you've got process modeling, you've got use case diagrams, you've got use case scenario, you've got swim lane diagrams, just to mention few amongst dozens of artifacts that you can generate. The framework itself will not be successful on its own. You will need additional best practices to enable it, to support it. As I mentioned, a couple of times so far, business analysis is one, so you need BABOK. Project management, so you need PMBOK or PRINCE2, whatever project management model you follow. You may want to use use case models. You may want to use some specific frameworks out in the industry, whether ITIL or SIAM or COBIT or whatever the case. So to make a long story short, the framework by itself, is not going to be very successful. It's going to be on an island. Also, you need to consider, the different roles and responsibilities, the different geographies, the different jurisdictions, all right, associated with your work. You want to make sure that your programs and services are accomplished, that your processes are established, and that your resources are used properly throughout the model. So this is from a public sector perspective, and there are a lot of discussions about this. If you belong to a government organization, then depending on which government, I mean, North America, between Canada and the US, there are a lot of additional reference models that you can tap into depending on who you're doing the work for, right? So this is something that you need to keep in mind as well. Again, going back to the discussion on the artifacts, right? So change requires collaborations and requires communication. And we need to have that common language that everybody understands, right? That common language is going to provide you clarity, is going to provide you the ability to align and to agree, and eventually the ability to transform, to desired state. So this is not just an issue of enterprise architecture. Usually when we're talking enterprise architecture, we're talking about the need to align, right, with the business. We need to talk about interoperability issues. We need to talk about, business issues, business transformation. We need to talk about the cost. We need to talk about many, items that will support. We need to talk about requirement. This is an example of a business analysis model whereby, you're going to use it to establish a number of things. As an example, establish who the stakeholders are, establish what the requirements are, document the requirement, test them, validate them, right? This is going to be the center of the universe for enterprise architecture. If you don't have it, well, you know what? It's not going to work. So something very important to consider. Something else that you need to consider is how you're going to introduce, the subject matter onto the organization. So even though this is not associated with service management per se, but the model itself is very useful for any other best practice. The timelines that we have here are subject to change based on complexity, size, geographical distribution, and a few other factors. And I'm sure you probably have seen something like this before. This is a continual improvement based on ITIL approach. So first and utmost, you need to know the vision, and then you need to figure out where you are, and then where you want to be or desired state, how you're going to bridge the gap, what kind of a roadmap you're going to need to establish, what kind of milestones and measurements, and how you're going to keep the momentum going over and over. So this becomes, a critical success factor to how you're going to introduce and implement your framework, right? Very important to keep in mind. Again, even though it's ITSM related, but it is the same approach that we all use as coaches and consultants and instructors to show how you're going to get to your desired state. At a high level, this is our introduction of TOGAF as an enterprise architecture model and some of the critical success factors that you're going to need to establish for it to be meaningful to your organization. Any questions that I can answer for you?
This is Paul. This is Paul. If you can hear me, Nasser, I would recommend everyone ask questions, because this is the time when you can. They say the only silly question is the one you don't ask. So it's guaranteed that people sitting next to you or on this presentation and your colleagues are going to be having the same kind of questions. If you're implementing TOGAF or some other framework and you're uncertain of why they're doing that or the direction they're taking or what the applicability is in your environment, you should also ask Nasser about the relevance of some of the certifications and what the value is in terms of your career. If you have any questions about that.
On that point, thanks for that, Paul. On that point, couple of things for you guys to keep in mind. Introducing TOGAF, number one, requires a certain level of maturity in the organization. Number two, as I mentioned, you're going to need some sort of a strategic approach, aligning different best practices in support of TOGAF as a framework for enterprise architecture. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. This is something that requires a great deal of alignment, at the strategic, tactical, and operational level of the organization. You're going to need the buy-in and the commitment from your executive team. You're going to need the governance board or the governance review board, whatever you want to call it, in your organization to speak the language. You're going to need to follow other best practices, right? Now, of course, in order for you to be able to do this, you need also to know the subject matter itself. So we provide, certifications at the foundation level and at the certified level. Usually, it's a combined course. It's either 4 or 5 days, depending on what is it that you would like to see in the course. So the 5 days usually is associated with a case study. So there is more practical experience associated with it than the 4 days. The 4 days also has some, but not to the extent of the 5 days. The reason I'm mentioning certifications is not to sell you the certification. It's to show you the value that you're going to have. This is an international accreditation. So this is not just Canada or the US per se. This is anywhere you go in the world, it's a recognized credential. So if you have some sort of IT industry experience and you have this certification, you will have basically opportunities, no sweat, right? The certification is good for your credentials, for your credibility, but also is good for your organizational's credibility, because that shows a level of maturity within the organization. All right, so something to think about. And please, if you have any questions, whether now or later on, you can communicate with Paul, and I will be more than happy to answer them for you. Something else.
Nasser, there is a question.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but there is a question. There's several. I'd like to read them to you, and or better yet, why don't you continue on, and I'll copy them and send them over to you. So just go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so let's go with the first question. The first question is, how can you apply TOGAF model for an already existing enterprise application which was built in a different model?
Well, it's actually a very good question, but if you already have an application in place, you can, based on new changes, any major changes that you're going to be doing, for the application, then you can follow the new model. If you already have an existing model, in other words, you're going to have, the combination of artifacts, right? And yes, you may have documentation as well, but what you're going to do is embed, the new artifacts that you're going to generate for the new change with the existing artifacts from the original setup. You need to translate, some of the documentation that you have onto the new repository. Now, there will be differences, initially anyway, until you evolve between the new and the target, right? So you have to keep that in mind. It's not going to happen with a click of a button where you basically translate everything overnight and that's that, right? Other questions?
Yeah, what is the transition approach?
So today, whatever model you follow, or if you don't follow, either or, you actually need to follow what we see on the screen. That is exactly your transition approach. So you need to figure out what's your strategy and what is your baseline. If you don't understand your baseline, then you really wouldn't know what level of people, process, technology you have in place, and how you're going to bridge the gap, for what TOGAF should look like in your organization. So there will be an assessment. The first thing you should do is do an architecture capability assessment, and based on that assessment, identify the gaps, and from there on, establish the roadmaps to bridge those gaps.
Is it possible to implement TOGAF in a small, medium enterprises? Not just it says small, medium, large, but I assume it really means small and medium size.
It's more logical. It's more beneficial into a medium to large organization. Small, you are working with the spirit of TOGAF, because this is not a small undertaking. This is a beast, right? And requires quite a bit of resources. So if you have a small organization, it's going to be an overkill to use it in its entirety. So you can use, you can still use it in spirit. So in other words, you follow some of the activities without having the formal, delegation of roles and responsibilities, because if you're a small business and you have 20 or 30 or even 50 people, you're not going to have 15 of them just to deal with TOGAF related issues. It becomes an overkill. So you're going to have the multiple hats approach in order to use TOGAF in spirit.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Oh, here you go. How can you prepare for the TOGAF certification? And I'll supplement that question with, can you self-study, or do you really need to take an exam, a study course of some sort? And if so, what's the value of the study course?
So the governing body allows people to do self-study. However, it's like taking you on a helicopter and throwing you in the deep end of the ocean while it's stormy. So it becomes very difficult. Even if you're wearing a life vest, it becomes very difficult for you to navigate, you know, and to find your way. There is a lot of information. We spent a lot of time and effort on designing and establishing quality approach, you know, for those courses where you actually get, you know, as we say, the crux of the matter. You get the balance between the examination requirements versus the reality requirements. You know, again, we have a case study that we use, we follow. So it's a much better type of engaging environment than just, you know, sit down and read the book for God knows how long, you know, and whether you don't understand the topic or another, then what do you do? So there are significant differences between the two approaches.
I will second that, even though I'm not a TOGAF expert at all. I have actually sat through programs that Nasser has delivered to our clients, and it is very clear there is a mountain of information, whatever the analogy you want to use. Ocean, mountain, it's huge. And I think the only way to get that absorbed is several things. One is to sit through, participate in the program, not sit through, but participate in the program. Ask questions like you're doing now. Really get your thoughts aligned, because this is a big topic. Obviously, it's a way of thinking, I believe, from my perspective, and it's also a way of adapting. And you need to see how it works for you. And so, applying and asking questions is the best way to do that. And again, certainly you can read through a massive amount of material, but you might be finding that you're spending 80% of your time on 10% of the important subjects. So I think it's very important to be aware that, you know, what's important and what's not as important, and what's really the focus of this, and that's best done with an expert. And we don't offer courses to the consumer, that is to say individuals, but we do that with large organizations, and probably your organization. If you're on this webinar, you probably have an organizational relationship with us. So ask your manager, see what upcoming TOGAF programs might be available. See if you can get a group of people together. We've done programs for your employers, most likely, and all you need to do is find a group of people that need the same kind of requirement, and they'll reach out to us, or you can reach out to us, and we'll speak to your training and development people. With that, there doesn't seem to be any other questions at the moment. Again, you can always send them off to us at helpdesk@starweaver.com. Once again, Nasser El-Battal has done a wonderful job of covering a lot in a short period of time. Of course, we're very sorry for the glitch at the beginning. If you want to go back to this, we'll send you a link to the prior webinars that have been done. And thank you very much, Nasser. Again, everyone, have a wonderful day, and appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.